Chapter 6. Our Voyage to Iceland. The hour of departure came at last. The night before, the worthy Mr. Thompson brought us the most cordial letters of introduction for Baron Tramp, Governor of Iceland, for Mr. Picterson, Coadjutor to the Bishop, and for Mr. Finson, Mayor of the town of Reykjavik. In return, my uncle nearly crushed his hands, so warmly did he shake them. On the 2nd of the month, at 2 in the morning, our precious cargo of luggage was taken on board the good ship Valkyrie. We followed and were very politely introduced by the captain to a small cabin with two standing bed places, neither very well ventilated nor very comfortable. But in the cause of science, men are expected to suffer.
Well, and we have a fair wind?
Cried my uncle in his most mellifluous accents.
An excellent wind, replied Captain Bjarn. We shall leave the Sound, going free with all sails set.
A few minutes afterwards, the schooner started before the wind, under all the canvas she could carry, and entered the channel. An hour later, the capital of Denmark seemed to sink into the waves, and we were at no great distance from the coast of Elsinore. My uncle was delighted. For himself, moody and dissatisfied, I appeared almost to expect a glimpse of the ghost of Hamlet. Sublime madman, thought I, you doubtless would improve our proceedings. You might perhaps even follow us to the center of the earth, there to resolve your eternal doubts. But no ghost or anything else appeared upon the ancient walls. The fact is, the castle is much later than the time of the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is now the residence of the keeper of the Strait of the Sound, and through that sound more than 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year. The castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the murky atmosphere, as well as the tower of Helsingborg, which raises its head on the Swedish bank. And here the schooner began to feel in earnest the breezes of Kattegat. The Valkyrie was swift enough, but with all sailing boats there is the same uncertainty. Her cargo was coal, furniture, pottery, woolen clothing, and a load of corn. As usual, the crew was small, 5 Danes doing the whole of the work.
How long will the voyage last?
Asked my uncle.
Well, I should think about 10 days,
Replied the skipper.
unless indeed we meet with some northeast gales among the Faroe Islands.
At all events, there will be no very considerable delay, cried the impatient professor.
No, Mr. Hardwig,
Said the captain.
no fear at all. At all events, we should get there some day.
Towards the evening, the schooner doubled Cape Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, crossed the Skagerrak during the night, skirted the extreme point of Norway through the gut of Cape Lindesnes, and then reached the northern seas. 2 days later, we were not far from the coast of Scotland, somewhere near what Danish sailors called Peterhead. And then Valkyrie stretched out direct for the Faroe Islands, between Orkney and Shetland. Our vessel now felt the full force of the ocean waves, and the wind shifting. We, with great difficulty, made the Faroe Isles. On the 8th day, the captain made out McGuinness, the westernmost of the isles, and from that moment headed direct for Portland, a cape on the southern shores of the singular island for which we were bound. The voyage offered no incident worthy of record. I bore it very well, But my uncle, to his great annoyance and even shame, was remarkably seasick. This mal de mer troubled him the more that it prevented him from questioning Captain Bjarn as to the subject of snaffles, as to the means of communication and the facilities of transport. All these explanations he had to adjourn to the period of his arrival. His time, meanwhile, was spent lying in bed, groaning and dwelling anxiously on the hoped for termination of the voyage. I didn't pity him. On the 11th day, we sighted Cape Portland, over which towered Mount Myrdalsjökull, which, the weather being clear, we made out very readily. The cape itself is nothing but a huge amount of granite standing naked and alone to meet the Atlantic waves. The Valkyrie kept off the coast, steering to the westward. On all sides were to be seen whole schools of whales and sharks. After some hours, we came in sight of a solitary rock in the ocean, forming a mighty vault through which the foaming waves poured with intense fury. The islets of Westman appeared to leap from the ocean, being so low in the water as scarcely to be seen until you were right upon them. From that moment, the schooner was steered to the westward in order to round Cape Reykjanes, the western point of Iceland. My uncle, to his great disgust, was unable to even crawl on deck. So heavy a sea was on, and thus lost the first view of the land of promise. 48 hours later, after a storm which drove us far to sea under bare poles, we came once more in sight of land and were boarded by a pilot who, after 3 hours of dangerous navigation, brought the schooner safely to an anchor in the Bay of Faxa before Reykjavik. My uncle came out of his cabin pale, haggard, thin, but full of enthusiasm, his eyes dilated with pleasure and satisfaction. Nearly the whole population of the town was on foot to see us land. The fact was that scarcely any of them but expected some goods by the periodical vessel. Professor Hardwig was in haste to leave his prison, or rather, as he called it, his hospital. But before he attempted to do so, he caught hold of my hand, led me to the quarterdeck of the schooner, took my arm with his left hand, and pointed inland with his right, over the northern part of the bay to where rose a high two-peaked mountain, a double cone covered with eternal snow. "Behold," he whispered in awe-stricken voice, "behold, Mount Snaffles." Then, without further remark, he put his finger to his lips, frowned darkly, and descended into the small boat which awaited us. I followed, and in a few minutes we stood upon the soil of mysterious Iceland. Scarcely we were fairly on the shore when there appeared before us a man of excellent appearance, wearing the costume of a military officer. He was, however, but a civil servant, a magistrate, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp. The professor knew whom he had to deal with. He therefore handed him the letters from Copenhagen, and a brief conversation in Danish followed, to which I, of course, was a stranger, and for a very good reason, for I did not know the language in which they conversed. I afterwards heard, however, that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the beck and call of Professor Hardwig. My uncle was most graciously received by Mr. Finson, the mayor, who, as far as costume went, was quite as military as the governor, but also from character and occupation quite specific. As for his coadjutor, Mr. Picterson, he was absent on an episcopal visit portion of the diocese. We were therefore compelled to defer the pleasure of being presented to him. His absence was, however, more than compensated by the presence of Mr. Fredrickson, professor of natural science in the College of Reykjavik, a man of invaluable ability. This modest scholar spoke no languages save Icelandic and Latin. When therefore he addressed himself to me in the language of Horace, we at once came to understand one another. He was, in fact, the only person that I did thoroughly understand during the whole period of my residence in this benighted island. Out of three rooms of which his house was composed, two were placed at our service, and in a few hours we were installed with all our baggage, the amount of which rather astonished the simple inhabitants of Reykjavik. Now, Harry, said my uncle, rubbing his hands, and goes well, the worst difficulty is now over. How the worst difficulty over? I cried in fresh amazement. Doubtless, here we are in Iceland. Nothing more remains but to descend into the bowels of the earth. Well, sir, to a certain extent, you are right. We have only to go down. But, as far as I'm concerned, that is not the question. I want to know how we are going to get up again. That is the least part of the business, and does not in any way trouble me. In the meantime, there is not an hour to lose. I am about to visit the public library. Very likely I may find there are some manuscripts from the land of Saknussemm. I shall be glad to consult them. In the meanwhile, I replied, I will take a walk through the town. Will you not likewise to do so? I feel no interest in the subject, said my uncle. What for me is curious in this land is not what is above the surface, but what is below. I bowed by way of reply, put on my hat and furred cloak, and went out. It was not an easy matter to lose oneself in the two streets of Reykjavik. I had therefore no need to ask my way. The town lies on a flat and marshy plain between two hills. A vast field of lava skirts it on one side, falling away in terraces towards the sea. On the other hand is the large bay of Faxa, bordered on the north by the enormous glacier of Sneffels, and in which bay the Valkyrie was then the only vessel at anchor. Generally, there were one or two English or French gunboats to watch and protect the fisheries in the offing. There were now, however, absent on duty. The longest of the streets of Reykjavik runs parallel to the shore. In this street, the merchants and traders live in wooden huts made with beams of wood, painted red, mere log huts, such as you find in the wilds of America. The other street, situated more to the west, runs toward a little lake between the residences of the bishop and the other personages not engaged in commerce. I had soon seen all I wanted of these weary and dismal thoroughfares. Here and there was a strip of discolored turf, like an old worn out bit of woolen carpet, and now and then a bit of kitchen garden, in which grew potatoes, cabbage, and lettuce, almost diminutive enough to suggest the idea of Lilliput. In the center of the new commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by an earthen wall. Though not very large, it appeared not likely to be filled for centuries. From hence, I went to the house of the governor, a mere hut in comparison with the mansion house of Hamburg, but a palace alongside the other Icelandic houses. Between the little lake and the town was the church, built in simple Protestant style and composed of calcined stones thrown up by volcanic action. I have not the slightest doubt that in high winds its red tiles were blown out, to the great annoyance of the pastor and congregation. Upon an eminence close at hand was the national school, in which were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish. In 3 hours, my tour was complete. The general impression upon my mind was sadness. No trees, no vegetation, so to speak. On all sides, volcanic peaks, the huts of turf and earth, more like roofs than houses. Thanks to the heat of these residences, grass grows on the roof, which grass is carefully cut for hay. I saw but few inhabitants during my excursion, but I met a crowd on the beach, drying, salting, and loading codfish, the principal article of exportation. The men appeared robust but heavy, fair haired like Germans, but of pensive mien, exiles of a higher scale in the ladder of humanity than the Eskimos, but I thought much more unhappy, since with superior perception they are compelled to live within the limits of the polar circle. Sometimes they gave vent to a convulsive laugh, but by no chance did they smile. Their costume consists of a coarse capote of black wool, known in Scandinavian countries as the vadmel, a broad brimmed hat, trousers of red serge, and a piece of leather tied with strings for shoe, a coarse kind of moccasin. The women, though sad looking and mournful, had rather agreeable features, without much expression. They wear a bodice and petticoat of summer wedmel. When unmarried, they wear a little brown knitted cap over a crown of plaited hair. But when married, they cover their heads with a colored handkerchief, over which they tie a white scarf. Chapter 7, Conversation and Discovery. When I returned, dinner was ready. This meal was devoured by my worthy relative with avidity and voracity. His shipboard diet had turned his interior into a perfect gulf. The repast, which was more Danish than Icelandic, was in itself nothing, but the excessive hospitality of our host made us enjoy it doubly. The conversation turned upon scientific matters, and Mr. Fridriksson asked my uncle what he thought of the public library. Library, sir? Cried my uncle. It appears to me a collection of useless odd volumes, and a beggarly amount of empty shelves. What? Cried Mr. Fridriksson. Why, we have 8,000 volumes of most rare and valuable works, some in the Scandinavian language, besides all the new publications from Copenhagen. 8,000 volumes, my dear sir? Why, where are they? Cried my uncle. Scattered all over the country, Professor Hardwig. We are very studious, my dear sir, though we do live in Iceland. Every farmer, every laborer, every fisherman can both read and write. And we think that books, instead of being locked up in cupboards, far from the sight of students, should be distributed as widely as possible. The books
of our library are therefore passed from hand to hand without returning to the library shelves, perhaps for years.
Then, when foreigners visit you, there is nothing for them to see?
Well, sir, foreigners have their own libraries. And our first consideration is that our humbler classes should be highly educated. Fortunately, the love of study is innate in the Icelandic people. In 1816, we founded the Literary Society and Mechanics Institute. Many foreign scholars of eminence are honorary members. We publish books destined to educate our people, and these books have rendered valuable services to our country. Allow me to have the honor, Professor Hardwick, to enroll you as an honorary member.
My uncle, who already belonged to nearly every literary and scientific institution in Europe, immediately yielded to the amiable wishes of good Mr. Fredrickson.
And now, he said, after many expressions of gratitude and goodwill, if you will tell me what books you expected to find, perhaps I may be of some assistance to you.
I watched my uncle keenly. For a minute or two, he hesitated, as if unwilling to speak. To speak openly was, perhaps, to unveil his project. Nevertheless, after some reflection, he made up his mind. Well, Mr. Fredrickson, he said in an easy, unconcerned kind of way, I was desirous of ascertaining if, among other valuable works, you had any of the learned Arne Saknussemm.
Arne Saknussemm, cried the professor of Reykjavik. You speak of one of the most distinguished scholars of the 16th century, of the great naturalist, the great alchemist, the great traveler.
Exactly so.
One of the most distinguished men connected with the Icelandic science and literature?
As you say, sir.
A man illustrious above all?
Yes, sir, all this is true, but his works.
We have none of them.
Not in Iceland?
There are none in Iceland or elsewhere, answered the other sadly.
Why so?
Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his works were publicly burned at Copenhagen by the hands of the common hangman.
Very good, capital, murmured my uncle, to the great astonishment of the worthy Icelander.
You said, sir?
Yes, yes, all is clear. I see the link in the chain. Everything is explained, and I now understand why Arne Saknussemm, put out of sort, forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret.
What secret?
A secret which, stammered my uncle.
Have you discovered some wonderful manuscript?
Cried Mr. Fredrickson. No, no, I was carried away by my enthusiasm, a mere supposition.
Very good, sir. But really, to turn to another subject, I hope you will not leave our island without examining into its mineralogical riches.
Well, the fact is, I am rather late. So many learned men have been here before me.
Yes, yes, but there is still much to be done,
cried Mr. Fredrickson. You think so, said my uncle, his eyes twinkling with hidden satisfaction.
Yes, you have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are which remain to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. Yonder on the edge of the horizon, you can see Sneffels.
Oh, yes, Sneffels, said my uncle.
One of the most curious volcanoes in existence. the crater of which has been rarely visited.
Extinct?
Extinct? Anytime these 500 years, was the ready reply.
Well, said my uncle, who dug his nails into his flesh and pressed his knees tightly together to prevent himself leaping up with joy. I have a great mind to begin my studies with the examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Cephal, what do you call it?
Sneffels, my dear sir.
This portion of the conversation took place in Latin, and I therefore understood all that had been said. I could scarcely keep my countenance when I found my uncle so cunningly concealing his delighted satisfaction. I must confess that his artful grimaces, put on to conceal his happiness, made him look like a new Mephistopheles.
Yes, yes, he continued. Your proposition delights me. I will endeavor to climb to the summit of Sneffels, and if possible, will descend into its crater.
I very much regret, continued Mr. Fridriksson, that my occupation will entirely preclude the possibility of my accompanying you. It would have been both pleasure and profitable if I could have spared the time.
No, no, 1,000 times no, cried my uncle. I do not wish to disturb the serenity of any man. I thank you, however, with all my heart. The presence of one so learned as yourself would no doubt have been most useful, but the duties of your office and profession before everything.
I entirely approve your project, continued the Icelander after some further remarks. It is a good idea to begin by examining this volcano. You will make a harvest of curious observations. In the first place, how do you propose to get to the Sneffels?
By sea, I shall cross the bay. Of course, that is the most rapid route.
Of course, but still cannot be done.
Why?
We have not an available boat in all of Reykjavik, replied the other.
What is to be done?
You must go by land along the coast. It is longer, but much more interesting.
Then I must have a guide?
Of course, and I have your very man.
Somebody on whom I can depend.
Yes, an inhabitant of the peninsula on which Sneffels is situated. He is a very shrewd and worthy man, with whom you will be pleased. He speaks Danish like a Dane.
When can I see him? Today?
No, tomorrow. He will not be here before.
Tomorrow be it, replied my uncle with a deep sigh.
The conversation ended by compliments on both sides. During the dinner, my uncle had learned much as to the history of Arne Seknussemm, the reasons for his mysterious and hieroglyphical document. He also became aware that his host would not accompany him on his adventurous expedition, and that next day we should have a guide. Chapter 8: The Eiderdown Hunter, Off at Last. That evening I took a brief walk on the shore near Reykjavik, after which I returned to an early sleep on my bed of coarse planks, where I slept the sleep of the just. When I awoke, I heard my uncle speaking loudly in the next room. I rose hastily and joined him. He was talking in Danish with a man of tall stature and of perfectly Herculean build. This man appeared to be possessed of very great strength. His eyes, which started rather prominently from a very large head, the face belonging to which was simple and naive, appeared very quick and intelligent. Very long hair, which even in England would have been accounted exceedingly red, fell over his athletic shoulders. This native of Iceland was active and supple in appearance, though he scarcely moved his arms, being in fact one of those men who despise the habit of gesticulation common to southern people. Everything in this man's manner revealed a calm and phlegmatic temperament. There was nothing indolent about him. His appearance spoke of tranquility. He was one of those who never seemed to expect anything from anybody, who liked to work when thought proper, and whose philosophy nothing could astonish or trouble. I began to comprehend his character simply from the way in which he listened to the wild and impassioned verbiage of my worthy uncle, while the excellent professor spoke sentence after sentence. He stood with folded arms, utterly still, motionless to all my uncle's gesticulations. When he wanted to say no, he moved his head from left to right. When he acquiesced, he nodded, so slightly that you could scarcely see the undulation of his head. The economy of motion was carried to the length of avarice. Judging from his appearance, which I should have been a long time before, I had suspected him to be what he was, a mighty hunter. Certainly his manner was not likely to frighten the game. How then did he contrive to get at his prey? My surprise was slightly modified when I knew that this tranquil and solemn personage was only a hunter of the eider duck, the down of which, after all, the greatest source of the Icelanders' wealth. In the early days of summer, the female of the eider, a pretty sort of duck, built its nest amid the rocks of the fjords, the name given to all narrow gulfs in Scandinavian countries, with which every part of the island is indented. No sooner has the eider duck made her nest than she lines the inside of it with the softest down from her breast. Then comes the hunter or trader. Taking away the nest, the poor, bereaved female begins her task over again, and this continues as long as any eider down is to be found. When she can find no more, the male bird sets to work to see what he can do. As, however, his down is not so soft and has therefore no commercial value, the hunter does not take the trouble to rob him of his nest lining. The nest is accordingly finished, the eggs are laid, the little ones are born, and next year the harvest of eider down is again collected. Now, as the eider duck never selects steep rocks or aspects to build its nest, but rather sloping and low cliffs near the sea, the Icelandic hunter can carry on his trade operations without much difficulty. He is like a farmer who has neither to plow, to sow, nor to harrow, only to collect his harvest. This grave, sententious, silent person, as phlegmatic as an Englishman on the French stage, was named Hans Björk. He had called upon us in consequence of the recommendation of Mr. Fredrickson. He was, in fact, our future guide. It struck me that had I sought the world over, I could not have found a greater contradiction to my impulsive uncle. They, however, readily understood one another. Neither of them had any thought about money. One was ready to take all that was offered him, the other ready to offer anything that was asked. It may readily be conceived, then, that an understanding was soon come to between them. Now, the understanding was that he was to take us to the village of Stapi, situated on the southern slope of the peninsula of Sneffels, at the very foot of the volcano. Hans, the guide, told us the distance was about 22 miles. a journey which my uncle supposed would take about 2 days. But when my uncle came to understand that they were Danish miles of 8,000 yards each, he was obliged to be more moderate in his ideas. And considering the horrible roads we had to follow, to allow 8 or 10 days for the journey. 4 horses were prepared for us, two to carry the baggage, and two to bear important weight of myself and uncle. Hans declared that nothing ever would make him climb on the back of any animal. He knew every inch of that part of the coast and promised to take us the very shortest way. His engagement with my uncle was by no means to cease with our arrival at Stapi. He was further to remain in his service during the whole time required for the completion of his scientific investigations. At the fixed salary of 3 rix dollars a week, being exactly 14 shillings and 2 pence, minus 1 farthing English currency. One stipulation, however, was made by the guide. The money was to be paid to him every Saturday night, failing which his engagement was at an end. The day of our departure was fixed. My uncle wished to hand the eiderdown hunter an advance, but he refused in one emphatic word, after, which being translated from Icelandic into plain English means after. The treaty concluded, our worthy guide retired without another word. A splendid fellow, said my uncle. Only he little suspects the marvelous part he is about to play in the history of the world. You mean then, I cried in amazement, that he should accompany us? To the interior of the earth, yes, replied my uncle. Why not? There were yet 48 hours to elapse before we made our final start. To my great regret, our whole time was taken up in making preparations for our journey. All our industry and ability were devoted to packing every object in the most advantageous manner. The instruments on one side, the arms on the other, the tools here and the provisions there. There were, in fact, 4 distinct groups. The instruments were, of course, of the best manufacture. Number one, a centigrade thermometer of Eigel counting up to 150 degrees, which to me did not appear half enough or too much. Too hot by half if degree of heat was to ascend so high, in which case we should certainly be cooked, not enough, if we wanted to ascertain the exact temperature of springs or metal in a state of fusion. A manometer worked by compressed air, an instrument used to ascertain the upper atmospheric pressure on the level of the ocean. Perhaps a common barometer would have not done as well, the atmospheric pressure being likely to increase in proportion as we descended below the surface of the earth. Number three, a first class chronometer made by Bosena of Geneva, set at the meridian of Hamburg, from which Germans calculate, as the English do from Greenwich, and the French from Paris. Number four, 2 compasses, one for horizontal guidance, the other to ascertain the dip. Number five, a night glass. Number six, 2 Ruhmkorff coils, which by means of a current of electricity would ensure us a very excellent, easily carried, and certain means of obtaining light. Number seven, a voltaic battery on the newest principle. Our arms consisted of 2 rifles with 2 revolving 6 shooters. Why these arms were provided, it was impossible for me to say. I had every reason to believe that we had neither wild beasts nor savage natives to fear. My uncle, on the other hand, was quite as devoted to his arsenal as to his collection of instruments, and above all, was very careful with his provisions of fulminating or gun cotton, warranted to keep in any climate, and of which the expensive force was known to be greater than that of ordinary gunpowder. Our tools consisted of two pickaxes, two crowbars, a silken ladder, three iron shod alpine poles, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges, some pointed pieces of iron, and a quantity of strong rope. You may conceive that the whole made a tolerable parcel, especially when I mentioned that the ladder itself was 300 feet long. Then there came the important question of provisions. The hamper was not very large, but tolerably satisfactory, for I knew that in concentrated essence of meat and biscuits there was enough to last 6 months. The only liquid provided by my uncle was Schiedam. Of water, not a drop. We had, however, an ample supply of gourds, and my uncle counted on finding water, and enough to fill them, as soon as we commenced our downward journey. My remarks as to the temperature, the quality, and even as to the possibility of none being found remain wholly without effect. To make up the exact list of our traveling gear for the guidance of future travelers, add that we carried a medicine and surgical chest with all apparatus necessary for wounds, fractures, and blows, lint, scissors, lancets, in fact, a perfect collection of horrible looking instruments, a number of vials containing ammonia, alcohol, ether, Goulard water, aromatic vinegar, in fact, every possible and impossible drug. Finally, all the materials for working the Ruhmkorff coil. My uncle had also been careful to lay in a goodly supply of tobacco, several flasks of very fine gunpowder, boxes of tinder, beside a large belt crammed full of notes and gold. Good boots rendered watertight were to be found to the number of 6 in the toolbox.
My boy, with such clothing, with such boots, and such general equipment, said my uncle, in a state of rapturous delight, we may hope to travel far.
It took a whole day to put all these matters in order. In the evening, we dined with Baron Tramp in company with the mayor of Reykjavik and Dr. Hjantalin, the great medical man of Iceland. Mayor Fredrickson was not present, and I was afterwards sorry to hear that he and the governor did not agree on some matters connected with the administration of the island. Unfortunately, the consequence was that I did not understand a word that was said at dinner, a kind of semi official reception. One thing I can say, my uncle never left off speaking. The next day, our labor came to an end. Our worthy host delighted my uncle, Professor Hardwig, by giving him a good map of Iceland, a most important and precious document for a mineralogist. Our last evening was spent in a long conversation with Mayor Fredrickson, whom I liked very much, the more that I never expected to see him or anyone else again. After this agreeable way of spending an hour or so, I tried to sleep. In vain. With the exception of a few dozes, my night was miserable. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened from the only real half hour sleep of the night by the loud neighing of horses under my window. I hastily dressed myself and went down into the street. Hans was engaged in putting the finishing stroke to our baggage, which he did in a silent, quiet way that won my admiration. And yet, he did it admirably well. My uncle wasted a great deal of breath in giving him directions. But worthy Hans took not the slightest notice of his words. At 6 o'clock, all our preparations were completed, and Mr. Fredrickson shook hands heartily with us. My uncle thanked him warmly in the Icelandic language for his kind hospitality, speaking truly from the heart. As for myself, I put together a few of my best Latin phrases and paid him the highest compliments I could. This fraternal and friendly duty performed, we sallied forth and mounted our horses. As soon as we were quite ready, Mayor Fredrickson advanced, and by way of farewell, called after me in the words of Virgil, words which appeared to have been made for us, travelers starting for an uncertain destination. And whichsoever way thou goest, may fortune follow.
Chapter 9. Our Start. We meet with adventures by the way. The weather was overcast but settled when we commenced our adventurous and perilous journey. We had neither to fear fatiguing heat nor drenching rain. It was, in fact, real tourist weather. As there was nothing I liked better than horse exercise, the pleasure of riding through an unknown country caused the early part of our enterprise to be particularly agreeable to me. I began to enjoy the exhilarating delight of traveling, a life of desire, gratification, and liberty. The truth is that my spirits rose so rapidly that I began to be indifferent to what had once appeared to be a terrible journey. After all, I said to myself, what do I risk? Simply to take a journey through a curious country, to climb a remarkable mountain, and if the worst comes to the worst, to descend into the crater of an extinct volcano. There could be no doubt that this was all this terrible Saknussemm had done. As to the existence of a gallery or of subterraneous passages leading into the interior of the earth, the idea was simply absurd, the hallucination of a distempered imagination. All then that may be required of me, I will do cheerfully and will create no difficulty. It was just before we left Reykjavik that I came to this decision. Hans, our extraordinary guide, went first, walking with a steady, rapid, unvarying step. Our two horses with the luggage followed of their own accord, without requiring whip or spur. My uncle and I came behind, cutting a very tolerable figure upon our small but vigorous animals. Iceland is one of the largest islands in Europe. It contains 30,000 square meters of surface and has about 70,000 inhabitants. Geographers have divided it into four parts, and we had to cross the southwest quarter, which in the vernacular is called Sudvestfjordung. Hans, on taking his departure from Reykjavik, had followed the line of the sea. We took our way through poor and sparse meadows, which made a desperate effort every year to show a little green. They very rarely succeed in a good show of yellow. The rugged summits of the rocky hills were dimly visible on the edge of the horizon through the misty fogs. Every now and then, some heavy flakes of snow showed conspicuous in the morning light, while certain lofty and pointed rocks were first lost in the gray low clouds, their summits clearly visible above, like jagged reefs rising from troublous sea. Every now and then, a spur of rock came down through the arid ground, leaving us scarcely room to pass. Our horses, however, appeared not only well acquainted with the country, but by a kind of instinct, knew which was the best road.
My uncle had not even the satisfaction of urging forward his steed by whip, spur, or voice. It was utterly useless to show any signs of impatience. I could not help smiling to see him look so big on his little horse. His long legs, now and then touching the ground, make him look like a 6-footed centaur. Good beast, he would cry. I assure you that I begin to think no animal is more intelligent than an Icelandic horse. Snow, tempest, impracticable roads, rocks, icebergs, nothing stops him. He is brave, he is sober, he is safe. He never makes a false step, never glides or slips from his path. I dare to say that if any river, any fjord has to be crossed, and I have no doubt there will be many, you will see him enter the water without hesitation, like an amphibious animal, and reach the opposite side in safety. We must not, however, attempt to hurry him. We must allow him to have his own way, and I will undertake to say that between us we shall do our 10 leagues a day. We may do so, was my reply, but what about our worthy guide? I have not the slightest anxiety about him. That sort of people go ahead without knowing even what they are about. Look at Hans. He moves so little that it is impossible for him to become fatigued. Besides, if he were to complain of weariness, he could have the loan of my horse. I should have a violent attack of the cramp if I were not to have some sort of exercise. My arms are right, but my legs are getting a little stiff. All this while we were advancing at a rapid pace. The country we had reached was already nearly a desert. Here and there could be seen an isolated farm, some solitary burr or Icelandic house built of wood, earth, fragments of lava, looking like beggars on the highway of life. These wretched and miserable huts excited in us such pity that we felt half disposed to leave alms at every door. In this country, there are no roads, paths are nearly unknown, and vegetation, poor as it was, slowly as it reached perfection, soon obliterated all traces of the few travelers who passed from place to place. Nevertheless, this division of the province, situated only a few miles from the capital, is considered one of the best cultivated and most thickly peopled in all Iceland. What then must be the state of the less known and more distant parts of the island? After traveling fully half a Danish mile, we had met neither a farmer at the door of his hut, nor even a wandering shepherd with his wild and savage flock. A few stray cows and sheep were only seen occasionally. What then must we expect when we come to the upheaved regions, to the districts broken and roughened from volcanic eruptions and subterraneous commotions? We were to learn this all in good time. I saw, however, on consulting the map, that we avoided a good deal of this rough country by following the winding and desolate shores of the sea. In reality, the great volcanic movement of the island and all its attendant phenomena are concentrated in the interior of the island. There, horizontal layers of strata of rocks piled upon the other, eruptions of basaltic origin, and streams of lava have given this country a kind of supernatural reputation. Little did I expect, however, the spectacle which awaited us when we reached the peninsula of Sneffels, where agglomerations of nature's ruins from a kind of terrible chaos. Some 2 hours or more after we had left the city of Reykjavik, we reached the little town called Aulkirkja, or the principal church. It consists simply of a few houses, not what in England or Germany we should call a hamlet. Hans stopped here 1/2 hour. He shared our frugal breakfast, answered yes and no to my uncle's questions as to the nature of the road, and at last, when asked where we were to pass the night, was as laconic as usual. Gardar was his one worded reply. I took occasion to consult the map to see where Gardar was to be found. After looking keenly, I found a small town of that name on the borders of Hvalfjord, about 4 miles from Reykjavik. I pointed this out to my uncle, who made a very energetic grimace.
Only 4 miles out of 22? Why, it is only a little walk.
He was about to make some energetic observation to the guide, but Hans, without taking the slightest notice of him, went in front of the horses and walked ahead with the same imperturbable phlegm he had always exhibited. 3 hours later, still traveling over those apparently interminable and sandy prairies, we were compelled to go round Kolarfjord, an easier and shorter cut than crossing the gulfs. Shortly after, we entered a place of communal jurisdiction called Edgelberg, and the clock of which would then have struck 12 if any Icelandic church had been rich enough to possess so valuable and useful an article. These sacred edifices are, however, very much like these people, and do without watches, and never miss them. Here, the horses were allowed to take some rest and refreshment. Then, following a narrow strip of shore between high rocks and the sea, they took us without further halt at the Alkirka of Brantar, and after another mile to Sorbur Annexia, a chapel of ease, situated on the southern back of Hvalfjord. It was 4 o'clock in the evening, and we have traveled 4 Danish miles, about equal to 20 English. The fjord was in this place about half a mile in width. The sweeping and broken waves came rolling in upon the pointed rocks. The gulf was surrounded by rocky walls, a mighty cliff, 3,000 feet in height, remarkable for its brown strata, separated here and there by beds of tufa of a reddish hue. Now, whatever may have been the intelligence of our horses, I had not the slightest reliance upon them as a means of crossing a stormy arm of the sea. To ride over salt water upon the back of a little horse seemed to me absurd. If they are really intelligent, I said to myself, they will certainly not make the attempt. In any case, I shall trust rather to my own intelligence than theirs. But my uncle was in no humor to wait. He dug his heels into the sides of his steed and made for the shore. His horse went to the very edge of the water, sniffed at the approaching wave, and retreated. My uncle, who was, sooth to say, quite as obstinate as the beast he bestrode, insisted on his making the desired advance. This attempt was followed by a new refusal on the part of the horse, which quietly shook his head. This demonstration of rebellion was followed by a volley of words and a stout application of whipcord, also followed by kicks on the part of the horse, which threw its head and heels upwards and tried to throw his rider. At length, the sturdy little pony, spreading out his legs in a stiff and ludicrous attitude, got from under the professor's legs and left him standing, with both feet on a separate stone, like the Colossus of Rhodes. Wretched animal! Cried my uncle, suddenly transformed into a foot passenger, and as angry and ashamed as a dismounted cavalry officer on the field of battle. Farja, said the guide, tapping him familiarly on the shoulder.
What? A ferry boat?
There, answered Hans, pointing to where lay the boat in question. There. Well, I cried, quite delighted with the information. So it is.
Why did you not say so before? Cried my uncle. Why not to start at once?
Didwaden, said the guide. What does he say? I asked, considerably puzzled by the delay and the dialogue.
He says died,
Replied my uncle, translating the Danish word for my information. Of course, I understand. We must wait till the tide serves.
For Bida?
Asked my uncle. Ja, replied Hans. My uncle frowned, stamped his feet, and then followed the horses to where the boat lay. I thoroughly understood and appreciated the necessity for waiting before crossing the fjord, for that moment when the sea, at its highest point, is in a state of slack water. As neither the ebb nor flow can then be felt, the ferry boat was in no danger of being carried out to the sea or dashed upon the rocky coast. The favorable moment did not come until 6 o'clock in the evening. Then my uncle, myself, and guide, two boatmen, and the four horses got into a very awkward flat bottomed boat. Accustomed as I had been to the steam ferry boats of the Elbe, I found the long oars of the boatmen but sorry means of locomotion. We were more than an hour in crossing the fjord, but at length the passage was concluded without accident. Half an hour later, we reached Garda.